What is up, guys? Welcome back to Day 3, Round 4 of His Majesty Mohammed VI International Chess Tournament in Morocco, Casablanca. My name is Titus Trimavicius, and I'm a chess grandmaster. I'm doing a recap of this event, which finished about a month ago, because A, I played a former world number 2 chess player in the world in this event, and B, it was one of my best tournaments ever, and I wanted to go over the games and share my experiences and thoughts with you from the event. So in round 3, I drew against a grandmaster from the Netherlands, Max Warmerdam, and I'm currently in 2.5 out of 3, so still a very good start for me. And in round 4, I got paired up against someone who had half a point less than me, Ponkratov Paval, a grandmaster from Russia. He's rated 2582, and he's a very strong player and used to be rated 2660 about 10 years ago or so. So definitely a very experienced and a very strong player. And I did have the black pieces. So my approach going into the game was to try and stay solid, which we already talked about in round 1 of this event, where I would just play my main sort of repertoire and see what happens basically. I believe my opponent, when I was preparing for him, played both e4, d4, both the closed openings and the open openings. And I was, I think, more expecting that he would play d4 against me, just because I felt like he's been playing it more recently, and I haven't played it against it in this event so far. And I thought I would also maybe be a little bit more predictable against d4, as I only play basically Queen's Game of Decline, whereas against e4, my opponent has to prepare against several Sicilians that I can potentially play. But also probably my opponent saw that I've had some losses against e4 recently, and I decided to play e4 after all. So as I mentioned, I was just going to go for a solid approach with my 4-knight Sicilian, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. And I wasn't really sure what my opponent was going to play, because I don't think he had that many recent games in this line. I think I was most expecting him to take on c6 in this position, and I was looking at lines in there, whether I would like to sharpen up the game and go for some theoretical battle there, or would I just try to make a draw in the most solid lines of this opening. Instead, my opponent played knight db5, and I sort of, respecting my opponent, don't play bishop c5, I play bishop b4, which is definitely basically just saying that, hey, I want to make a draw, rather than try to muddy up the waters and play for some sort of an imbalance and potentially a win. My opponent obviously plays the main line. I play d5, and here I was kind of hoping that my opponent will play bishop d3, which is the line that I've checked more recently than if he had taken on ed5, because after e5, bishop d3, there's some lines, castles, of course, and then there's some options with d4. Bishop g4 is, I think, very trendy these days. So I wasn't sure which one I would choose, because I've looked at all of them, but I didn't again necessarily check them before the game, and those lines are very, I would say, stale for black's perspective, as you're just trying to sort of get a active enough position to compensate for your structural deficiencies and also the lack of two bishops. But you do have a better center control, so basically that's what you're kind of playing around. And if white can finish his development and try and start corralling that weak pawn on d5, then you could potentially end up in trouble. So I was very happy to see bishop d3, because again, I've kind of, I would say, checked this more recently, and I remembered some ideas. Obviously not every single one. Mostly in my blitz games, people play bishop e3, but after checking my file after the game, I noticed that rook e1 is a very interesting move, for example, and there's this cute line with knight d4 and bishop e4, pinning the bishop and winning it back because the pawn on c2 is pinned after bishop e4. Also, I checked the database after the game as well, and I think in this position I saw that Jonas Bjerre from Denmark, I believe, played king d2 in this position, which was more or less a novelty at that point. Very interesting move indeed, just trying to bring the king basically to c3. Excuse me. So there was definitely some interesting ideas my opponent could have chosen. Instead, he plays what I would consider sort of the main approach, bishop e3, and I basically knew that you have to play f5 and e5 to establish center control. And now my opponent has at least 3-4 moves that he can play. Bishop d2 is a move. Again, king d2 is an idea. Rook e1 is an idea. my opponent decides to play king c1. And basically, the thing that I remembered most distinctly was that if my opponent decides to move the king to the c file, I shouldn't long castle anymore because the rook on d8 is not going to do much work. And I should instead put the rook immediately on c8 and play against this sort of diagonal. Or file, I guess. So my opponent, started to think in this position as well. I think I maybe thought for about 10 to 15 minutes on rook c8. He decides to also think for about 15 minutes or so and plays bishop d5, which is no longer in my notes. I wasn't really like remembering them necessarily anyway, but it was a new move for me. And I was already on my own here. And basically, I was trying to work out sort of a strategy, how to establish some sort of an initiative while my opponent's pieces are not yet consolidated and developed. Because if my opponent connects the rooks and puts this king, for example, with b3, bishop b2, king b2 rather, then his position would be very harmonious. There is no counterplay against the c pawn anymore. He has the two bishops. My pawns look active, but also kind of vulnerable potentially in the long run, and also my pieces are a little bit clumsy. If you notice, this knight it's kind of hard to move this knight because he doesn't have any good squares, and also the pawn on b7 is hanging. The bishop is completely dominated right now by the bishop on d5. So it's definitely in black's best interest to sort of act quickly and decisively. So after thinking for a while, I find this forced line, f4, bishop c5, b6, bishop d6. And here I was still choosing, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was mainly choosing between knight d4 and the bishop f5. The computer points out that in this position, bishop g4 is an amazing move. Basically, the idea is that you control the d1 square, so your opponent can't play rook d1, and the main idea is just to kick the bishop out of d6 with king d7. And as you notice, the bishop is kind of trapped on d6. It stands very actively. It definitely, controls a lot of squares and attacks the pawn on e5. But at the same time, it is vulnerable to being attacked and being sort of trapped. So bishop g4 would have been an amazing resource had I spotted. Instead, I was choosing between knight d4, but I couldn't really find full equality after c3, and then I thought, bishop c6 is maybe a move, and we would get some sort of a position like this where I'm currently a pawn down. I'm not sure what to sort of do in this position to regain it. Maybe there's nothing I can do in the first place. I believe the best move here might be just to castle, try to play for some sort of compensation on the light squares, but I am still a pawn down. The position might be holdable, but it's definitely not the most pleasant one, where you're just kind of a pawn down and trying to make a draw. So instead, I decided to play bishop f5, and basically I saw this very clumsy looking line for black with knight d4, c3, rook d8. Again, playing against these two bishops that are kind of overextended. But again, I could only play against these bishops after I moved the bishop, so that was basically more one of the ideas as well. My opponent obviously reacted with rook d1. And now we get this sort of clumsy looking line after rook takes d6, de5, and I have nothing better than to just go back rook d8. And you might say, oh, Titus, you just lost a pawn, just like in the previous line. What gives, Why is this position different from the previous one? Well, the main difference is that, my opponent's king is very vulnerable in this position. It doesn't really have a move right now in this position. B, my opponent's extra pawn is also quite vulnerable in this position, right? So it's difficult sort of to consolidate this extra pawn quickly, whereas my counterplay on the c file potentially can come very quickly indeed. Also, king e7 is a very natural move, and I just bring my rooks basically and activate my pieces, and my moves are very simple in this position, where I think white's moves aren't all that clear if he tries to play for an advantage. So my opponent plays b4, which I kind of expected. I played rook c8 check, and I think my opponent here makes sort of his first, I wouldn't say necessarily a big mistake, but first mistake, trying to press for a win. He plays king b2. Basically, I believe he overlooked my idea, just based on body language and his expressions during the game. What I thought he should have done was play king d2 and basically try to bring the king to this side of the board where I think it's safer. He maybe concedes more control of the c file, but the position sort of remains more or less tenable for white in that way. I would probably play king e7, he would play king e1, and then I'd probably play like rook c3 or rook d8, I'm not sure, like one of these two moves. And, the evaluation, I think, is still like very slightly better for white, but it's very hard to sort of consolidate this extra pawn with the passive king and my rooks being extremely active as they are. And I was fully expecting to hold a draw here, so to speak. Whereas after b4, rook c8, king d2, again, my opponent probably just overlooked that I can play rook c2. And after king d3, I don't do anything rash. I don't concede control of the c file. Whereas after rook f2, for example, rook e1 could potentially come. And then my king could become very quickly under fire. I only want a single pawn. I can't really take on g2. There's no bishop c2 ideas because the rook goes to c1. And basically the rook is threatening to come to c7. And I think black's position is just busted. But I can, ignore the pawn on f2 for the moment and just play king e7. And basically my ideas, excuse me, are connected with, bringing the second rook to the c file and then potentially challenging white's king, some mating nets in this position. So my opponent, here he should already switch to damage control, so to speak. And basically that's what he does. Rook dc1, I think, is more or less forced to sort of mitigate my threats. And here I think my opponent was, I don't know, I really don't know what he was thinking. It's very baffling to me. Maybe he just, again, saw my rating and he was like, oh, this guy, sucks at chess. I can't, let the game finish here. Because I think if my opponent played rook a2, I would have no choice basically but to take. Then bishop e6. We trade back. And again, just showcasing how weak this pawn really is. My opponent could play, for example, bishop b3 first. Doesn't really make much of a difference. I can start even with b5 because, after this I can, still take and basically attack the pawn on e6, and I'm just in time to collect it. My opponent can't infiltrate on a4 and c4 because the pawn on b5 restricts his king, and this position should be a very sort of easy pawn-ending draw with no real chances for either side. Instead, my opponent plays rook f1, which doesn't necessarily throw away the game, but is definitely, I would say, from a practical point of view, a step in the wrong direction. And here I remember I was sort of, again, very, very shocked my opponent played rook f1, and I was trying to find the most concrete way to punish it. Again, safe to say there is no way to punish it, so I can only play the game with non-forcing moves like rook d2, bishop c4, and I decided to go for bishop e6, king c3, bishop c4, very important, attacks the rook, so my opponent can't take the rook on d2, king c4, king e6, and again, this position is, of course, a draw, but, I mean, looking at it from a practical point of view, I think it's much more difficult to play as white, and I think, in fact, there's only one clean way to sort of hold a draw in this position, which is with king c3. Basically forcing my rook to avoid or give up the d file, where my opponent's king can defend the pawn on e5, and then switch your rook from passivity to activity with rook c1. Excuse me. And this position should be more or less a straightforward draw. Pawns are equal, right? Both rooks are more or less active. Both kings are also quite active. Neither side can really boast of any sort of meaningful advantages in this position. That's why the position should be a draw, even though there's still a good amount of play left. And I'm sure, it can be misplayed by both sides, so to speak. But it should be a draw. Instead, my opponent plays, in this position, king b5. Which again is a step in the wrong direction. Rook a2, only move to claim an advantage. And after a4, I decided that I don't really even need to recapture the pawn on e5 just yet, and I played g5. And here I don't know if my opponent already realized how much trouble he was in. The engine is already saying claiming a big advantage for black. Again, on the grounds of basically active rook versus passive rook. And white's biggest problem is that once I start collecting the pawns on the king side, my pawn's already quite far advanced as well. So that's basically why black's position is preferred. And here he very confidently, or rather confidently, plays pawn to g4. And during the game, again, I was kind of unsure of the evaluation of this position. Again, I mean, it feels like I'm, should be better, but I was kind of being very modest about my advantage in my evaluation at the very least. And I wasn't really sure what to do here, and I was calculating for about, again, 10 to 15 minutes, using basically my last long think for this position. And luckily for me, I managed to find the best move, which is pawn to f3. Again, basically the idea is, you keep your opponent's rook passive, and you push your pawn further down the board. where it can, if the pawn on f2 were to fall, then it's closer to being promoted. My opponent plays rook e1. I play rook e2 pretty fast. I didn't really want to play rook f2 during the game because I felt like my opponent then maybe could play some rook e3 nonsense, and I just wasn't really in the mood of trying to figure out what to do here, because I felt like if I play h5, he can probably play h3, and then it's kind of hard to collect this pawn on g4. My king is sort of stuck, passively blocking this pawn on e5, and I was just really unsure of how I should break through here. Whereas I thought after rook e2, if my opponent plays back, at the very least he has made no progress, and I can, sort of freely think of an improvement for me. And if there is an improvement, again, during the game I wasn't completely sure if this position is winning, but in fact it is quite simply and quite easily. Basically, the main idea is to get a position something like this, where you forego the pawn on a7, but you also restrict the b file, so the opponent's king can never sort of escape and push the pawn forward. And it will take, while white creates the pass pawn first, it will take him many more moves to actually get his king out of the corner and promote it, whereas I'm very quick with my king e2, king f2 ideas. Again, this didn't seem super obvious to me during the game, but safe to say I probably would have been able to figure it out if we were to go down that road. Instead, my opponent plays rook a1, and now I quickly spotted that there is a very simple and very clean win, which is just to take a pawn on f2. After king e6, excuse me, you just take the pawn on h2 again, and after king e7, it seems like white is doing some progress, but after h5, I start pushing 2 pawns instead of 1, and eventually I can even give up my rook for one of the pawns, and then I will promote 2 instead of 1. So my opponent in this position, quite disgruntled and disgusted, throws in the towel and resigns. So a very sort of weird game where I think that luckily for me I managed to remember my notes that I had looked at a while ago. I didn't check this opening before the game at all. But I didn't know this idea that if your opponent plays, the king to c1, you shouldn't long castle, and you should put the rook in the c file immediately against your opponent's king. And then my opponent just overpressed. I mean, he had a very slight advantage, I believe, but it just shows like that this line is very solid for black. And in general, whenever I play online with bishop d3, I'm sure I've lost some games, but I've never felt like I was, in any sort of danger necessarily to start the game. So a very, very important win against a very strong player, 25-82 with black. It puts me at 3.5 out of 4 with a second game on day 3 still to be played. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the recap for that game. And it's going to be a doozy.